Go
Good
ahead,
evening
Rina.
and a very warm welcome to Tata Literature Live Business Shastras. I am Reena Agrawal from Literature Live. Our book in focus for this evening's edition of Business Shastras is Leadership to Last: How Great Leaders Leave Legacies Behind by Jeffrey Jones and Tarun Khanna. Joining us this evening is one of the authors, Tarun Khanna, Giorgio Paulo Lehman Professor, Harvard Business School, and Director, Lakshmi Mittal and Family, South Asia Institute, Harvard University, and Zia Mody, a leading corporate lawyer and businesswoman. They will be in conversation with corporate advisor and author, Mr. R. Gopalakrishnan. Before I invite Mr. Gopalakrishnan to take this evening forward, may I remind you all to send in your questions for the Q&A segment, which will start around 6:45 p.m. At the end of the session, 5 questions with gift vouchers from Tata Click are all waiting for you. So send in your questions to info@litlive.in. Thank you. Over to you, RJ. Have a lovely conversation, all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rina. It's a great pleasure. And we can assure you we'll have a lovely conversation, but I hope the audience agrees because we know each other. But more importantly, we're going to be discussing the ideas in a very interesting and important book. Uh, Tarun Khanna is one of the most distinguished professors in Harvard, and Mumbai's legal eye is Zia Mody. So I feel greatly honored. And the book we're going to discuss, I'm repeating this because the audience may not have had a chance, is called Leading Leadership to Last. And it is a very interesting book. I shall talk about it through my questions to Tarun rather than my commenting on the book. Um, Let me begin with Tarun. We'll go back and forth, and please feel free to sort of contribute and chip in because that will make it a conversation rather than a interrogation, which is to anyway inappropriate. Tarun, your co-author is not here with you, but I'm curious about Jeffrey Jones because I've read a book called Renewing Unilever back in 2005, and if I remember right, that book had about one third or one fourth the number of pages of bibliography as compared to text. And I said, my God, this is a serious Ram Guha type of uh, Englishman or a Welshman or whatever he is. Is he the same person or is he somebody else?
Gopal, first of all, nice to be with you and Zia. Same guy. Jeff is a card-carrying historian, um, and moved to Harvard from England 15, 20 years ago. And he and I have worked together on a sort of this underlying database from which this book comes. It's a database of interesting, entrepreneurs and leaders from emerging markets around the world, whom people don't always engage with front and center. And the idea is to take their stories and make them a publicly available free resource for teaching and scholarship around the world so that people can learn from them. So Jeff and I kind of collaborated for the last 10 years on putting together this. And the reason for writing the book is primarily to draw attention to the stories, but as much to draw attention to the underlying resource, which, Gopal, is just unbelievable. It's completely free and everybody should use it. It's literally hundreds of hours of original video of people speaking very candidly about the arc of their careers, as Zia did very kindly with me some years ago. Um, so Jeff and I collaborated to do it. Um,
Well, that's reassuring to know that Jeff can write a book without one fourth of it being bibliography. That must be your influence, Tarun. But I found one is I've got a whole section in my library here under the broad name of leadership, and I've done some of the writing myself. But your book is organized in a very innovative way. At the very least, it's unusual, but I think it's quite innovative. You see, most leadership books interview people or companies as the case may be, and then they write a long narrative, sometimes as a case study, sometimes as a chapter, sometimes as a whole book. And then they slice and dice it to show like a well-cut diamond, multiple facets of that leader or three, four leaders as the case may be. You've done the other way around. You sort of sliced and diced it, and then you run a number of leaders through that they're all doing the same thing. And since the audience may not have read the book yet, I hope they will. I just want to mention what I mean by slices of leadership. This book is covered in 7 chapters, contest. It starts with managing families, and 4, 5, 6 people have been interviewed, and the lesson from each interview is sort of summarized at the end. Then committing to values is the second one. Innovating for impact is the third one. Contesting corruption is the fourth one. Challenging gender stereotypes is the fifth one. Promoting inclusion is the sixth one. And the seventh one is creating value responsibly. So 7 unexceptionable sort of slices. And within each slice, he has sprinkled salt and pepper, if I may use that expression, or some spices, which is different people. And it's a very different way of arranging the book. Can you tell us a bit about how you came to this kind of an arrangement? What was your purpose?
Yeah, as you say, Gopal, these are, incontestably important aspects, contesting stereotypes, innovating, fighting corruption, so on and so forth. So that's certainly not the innovation. I think the innovation, to the extent that there is any, is that we are showing that we can learn from a collage of responses from different men and women from across 20, 25 countries. And I have to say that, about a third of our interviews are from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal. And this book is written for the Indian audience. So we've sort of, overweighted on Indian and to some extent other South Asian examples. But the intent is to produce a similar one for Latin America and a similar one for Africa. Because we find that people in these societies, of course, want to learn from those who have emerged from similar milieux as themselves. That's the first thing. But they're also open to relating it to other people from other similar-ish, if you wish, geographies who can show them the extent to which, let's say, what Zia is doing in contesting gender stereotypes as we profile. Of course, Zia is doing a lot more, but in this instance, that's what we're picking on, is to some extent similar to somebody in Brazil or in South Africa or in Pakistan. I have a very good friend in Pakistan, Seema Aziz, who's done some amazing work with women and schooling and so on. And we want readers to, first of all, hear it straight from the proverbial horse's mouths. So the actual excerpts from that you were referring to a moment ago are literally excerpts from the transcripts of video interviews that we did with these people. And the reader can see for themselves. Jeff and I, our contribution is primarily to A, of course, create the library over 10 years and to continue to do that. And we had almost 25 different Harvard faculty collaborate in producing the archive. And then to curate this little assemblage, right, that we are putting forward for people's consumption and edification and hopefully even enjoyment in some ways. So that's the intent of the exercise. But you're absolutely right. We're flipping around the traditional recipe of, I see how HDFC grew exponentially behind you on your shelf. So there you would take Deepak. You would take Deepak and you would say, okay, Deepak did some amazing things, which of course he did, and then analyze it and say these are the lessons that we think that this author, thinks Deepak did. We're flipping it around. We say a number of men and women around the world have contested gender stereotypes, have promoted women in economic life, and here they are. Here are 6 or 7 of them. Zia is one of them. And so let's kind of think about the collection of ways in which they've done this.
Okay, thanks. We don't, as you rightly pointed out, want to cast Zia into the mold of only talking about gender stereotypes. So Zia, if you agree, I have two sorts of questions to address to you. One is on the gender stereotypes, because I read the chapter under that chapter. I read your story, and I have one or two questions for the benefit of the audience. But then, towards the end of this discussion, there are broader questions about leadership, which I will address to both of you, so that we don't by inadvertently cast you in the gender stereotype mold and Tarun in the overall book mold, but that's not quite appropriate. So yeah, I loved your story. I'll tell you what I loved about it. I mean, being a resident of Bombay, I mean, I've heard of AZB. When I was in service in Tata's, we've dealt a lot with AZB. But it blew my mind to know that you're now 400 associates. I presume associates means lawyers of various levels of
Lawyers.
experience, and 50% of them are women. 50%. I mean, that they are no more a minority. But, it must have taken an enormous amount of grit, determination to be able to build that. And while I have enjoyed reading it for the benefit. You could either read out the chapter, but usually I like to prefer you to narrate the story to the audience, because they can always read the book and get the record of it. So, would you like to tell us a little bit about your challenges and experiences on the matter
Sure,
of building
happy
up?
to.
Yeah.
Happy to. I think that, I was the eldest child with three brothers coming after me. So I had the top slot in terms of initial attention. And I think that a lot of it had to do with, like for all of us, and I'm sure for everybody in the audience, just how we were brought up. And being a Baha'i by religion, my mother, who was also a Baha'i, one of our 10 commandments is equality between men and women. So my poor father, who was not a Baha'i, had no choice but to fall in line. And so, we were just brought up as if there was no difference into how we should perceive ourselves, or we would be allowed to be perceived. And so I think when you grow up not having that mental block, sometimes when you go into a courtroom, as I have narrated in the early years, I was quite stunned to see I was one of two women or three women. But you learn to get over that. I think in the firm now, Gopal, we're nearly 500, not 400, since Tarun wrote the book. But I think the real issue is understanding what women need. I think, and it's not so difficult. And I think that men are getting the plot more and more. For me, it is the man who will really bring about change. Some of us women in the C-suite or as CEOs, but we're few and far between. Today, the C-suite is still men. And if we don't have male champions, this can't really become institutionalized. And so I think that it's all about communication. It's nothing than understanding what anybody needs, like any employer or any person who's working with you needs. It's understanding what their pain points are. So we've been delighted because, I truly believe that a woman who works with you is stickier, generally loyal, doesn't need to rock her comfort zone unless she's forced to. And after all the training we've put into her, for God's sakes, why would we let her go? Makes absolutely no sense. And therefore, I think it's all about, the boss or the HR or whoever it is, allowing an atmosphere where the woman can walk in and say, I need this. Very often, it's a Venus and Mars story. Women are diffident, they just go away and they just say, okay, I can't work anymore. And they don't ask for what they want. And I think in this age, and where talent is, at a premium, we should be encouraging women to ask what they need to stay with us. This is my sense, especially during COVID. Because, Gopal, you've read all the articles where really one of the biggest classes, asset classes, if you like, that have been hit is women. They've actually gone out of the pipeline, the employment pipeline, even more than their male counterparts would. So I think this is a great time for this topic to come up. And, I'm sure Tarun has his thoughts. I'm sure, Gopal, you have thoughts, given the seniority and the time with which you spent with the house. So this was my takeaway from my lesson and my learnings.
No, I think your story has come out particularly well. I mean, I have talked to Kiran Mazumdar as well on exactly this. You don't have to ask her to talk on this subject because it comes naturally in Kiran's narrative. But, as the husband of one woman, as the father of two daughters, and as the grandfather of three granddaughters, I'm personally very much exposed to the atmosphere where women and men seek and what obstacles that they face. So I was very interested. I remember when I used to be in Unilever back in 70s or 80s, they were most hesitant to hire IIM Ahmedabad women graduates because they could not become sales managers dealing with kirana shops. And I think the company took a bold move and sent one of these girls into work in the wholesale market, which is quite a messy sort of place, But I have to say, over the last so many years, women have done so well, taking on the same jobs that men do. And of course, the composition of the management committee of Hindustan Lever today, I think half of them are women, just like AZB, except is tribute to the fact that they have persisted. So that part of the book on gender is very interesting. I also was very intrigued by your story. Actually, I don't know if it was intrigued or touched or a bit of both. Again, as a father of two daughters, the story of failure, the first time you lost in the court and so on. So, would you, because many people are so stressed with the situation that we have, competitive situation, share with us, share with the audience.
Sure. So, as I've said in the chapter that Tarun has written, I came back from America and I came back to a totally different world. It was almost Dickensian. I was sitting in a very posh Manhattan office at Baker and McKenzie, came back to the court in Bombay, where you shared a desk of about 4 feet with my senior, and there was just very little space, literally, physically, to read your papers. And I used to work really hard for two reasons. One is I was completely blown away at the fact that I was one of the less than 5 women that would have to open her mouth, that the courtroom would have 100 male lawyers looking at me, and I was paranoid that I would make a mistake. So I just over-prepared. And in this one case, where I thought I had a really good case, and I lost, and I was really devastated because the logic of the loss. I was completely convinced that the propositions that I was putting forward were right, but I lost. And it was my first really bad losing, where I was very weepy, spoke to my father, who was also a lawyer, and he must have, won and lost hundreds of cases in his life. So he listened to me very sympathetically on the phone. He was in Delhi while I was sort of, sniffling away. And then I could just see the amusement on his face on the other line. And he says, but darling, somebody has to lose. And don't worry, the client will appeal. And when you appeal, you argue first. So you make your point to the judge, and the appeal court will hear you. So that was little solace to me at that time. But as I grew as I grew older into the profession, I realized that one, you can lose. Two, sometimes you may deserve to lose, sometimes you may not. But that's never a total loss, because you always have the option to prove yourself going forward. So he taught me how to not go overboard about it, and also gave me the next step, which was a possible solution, and again challenged me to prove my skill set by winning in the appeal.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me of a tennis player of yesteryear, Stefan Edberg, who was, like all top tennis players, very competitive, but he was very charming. When he lost a match, and in the post-match interview, he would say, well, I reckon he played better than me. Right? He didn't say he did play better. He didn't say he did not play better. He did not blame his luck. He said, I reckon he played better than me. but this is known be the last match of my career. And you are giving the court case equivalent of that tennis match. So it's a very, very nice and lovely story. I want to flip back, if I may, to Tarun. Tarun, when I got your book, by the way, we are talking about the book and its chapters because that's the purpose of the exercise. It's some of these things, therefore, ask you to repeat. It may be a repetition for you, but for the person who's not read the book, it is useful to get a flavor. That's the whole purpose of the exercise. The title of your book set me thinking: Leadership to Last, and the subtitle said, "How Great Leaders Leave Legacies Behind." Now, whenever you give the title of a book, I know it happens. Having written so many myself, it happens the last minute of the publisher and so on, and it tends to be a bit judgmental and anecdotal. But how did you figure out these leaders have leaderships which will last? And what legacy that leader is leaving? I mean, it could be a legitimate question from a reader's perspective. How did you choose them? You just chose 10 people, or you had some method in the madness?
So Gopal, the title, as you said, is in two parts: is Leadership to Last, and then How Great Leaders Leave Legacies Behind. How great leaders leave legacies behind is not by design, but Leadership to Last is by design, because I think that the purpose here, I'm sitting at Harvard Business School, and we're lucky to have a lot of talented students pass through, and they're all very ambitious, and they go out and, the hottest thing in the last 10, 15 years has been, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to build a company, and it's going to be a unicorn, or it's going to be a super unicorn, right? And then they take them public, and they become gazillionaires, and they're really happy, and then it crashes, right? Very often, right? So we were trying to draw a distinction between companies that are organizations, though I should qualify. The book is not only about, as I would describe, for-profit entrepreneurs. It's about entrepreneurship in the sense of being creative, in the sense of creating an organization. So, one of my mentors, if I may say, was Abed Bhai, Fazle Hassan Abed in Bangladesh, who built the world's biggest NGO, BRAC. It's literally in 18 countries, saves tens of millions of lives every year. And it's an organization. He gave up his career as head of Shell, Royal Dutch Shell in Asia, to go and build this, when Bangladesh was formed. It's an extraordinary, I think it's one of the best run organizations, period, not just limited to the nonprofit world. So we picked entities that had literally lasted. So to some extent, Gopal, the selection criteria here is incredibly simple. You look out of your window, you see which are the organizations that have been around for decades, that look like they have a stable purpose, that if we ask the reasonably educated man or woman on the street, is this something that you recognize as being a significant outfit, they would unambiguously say yes. And I have to say, again, the privilege of being at an institution that's, I hope, respected, or at least recognized, I don't think there was a single instance of reaching out to any person in the world that they said no. Not one. In one instance, between the time of asking and the time that
is there a bell ringing somewhere? No. Oh, please continue. Sorry.
No. I was just saying that nobody turned us down.
To tell whose end it is at, so the audience doesn't get disturbed. Can you mute them? Okay, go ahead. Please, sorry for the interruption.
No, I was just saying that the selection criteria is very simple. There's nothing complex here. We just literally looked out the window and found organizations that had lasted and that were super respected in their organization, and asked the person whether they would consent to sit down for a couple of hours in a free-flowing conversation. And that entire conversation is recorded and edited and saved on our website, and anybody can go to it. It's the Creating Emerging Markets website at Harvard Business School, and download anything, and it's incredible. So it's the last part of Leadership to Last that I think is the distinguishing feature here.
But Tarun, if I may cast a critical eye on the content and the title, some of the interviews are 5, 6, 7 years old. So I can understand if it's part of that project, then obviously you accumulated these like a bank balance over a period of time. But there are some examples where a reader could ask himself, but is this leadership that lasts? For example, under family business,
Mhm.
you have written about Murugappa. Now,
Mhm.
we are not here to discuss Murugappa by
Yeah.
any yardstick. But then, as soon as your book comes out, we read it and you say, well, there's a big family dispute going on and he's eulogizing their family. Or in the case of Mallika Sarabhai, who's a hugely accomplished woman, which is the institution you're referring to? Because Darpana was started by her mother. So
Mhm.
those were the sort of um, not inaccuracies, but those are the ones which caused the cracks that caused the question in my mind. And I'm asking
Oh,
this because the person who reads it may have the same question.
I'm sure there are many more cracks, Gopal, than the two that you pointed to. So, when we write books, at least when I write books, or when Jeff writes a history book, I guess we're less concerned about the immediacy of it. I've certainly written plenty of things where I try to draw inference in the past 30 years from what had happened, from the data that were available at the time. And then, the world's a messy place, and some things change after that, and errors are made. So I presume that's sort of what happened here. Um, I think if you look at almost any of the interviews in the book or in the database, there is something to learn at the time of the process. And just one comment on some of them are old. But the project has been going on for 10, 15 years on an ongoing basis, and it's a perpetual project. It continues. The intent is to build the library as a public good. So, of course, by definition, things will, quote unquote, not be immediately current. So, we're not the newspaper. We're not writing for today's headlines. We're
And,
simply
and,
looking
and you
at it.
could produce a multi-volume books or multi-episodes of videos and so on and so forth, because this is like the Harvard project on happiness started in
Yeah,
1942,
yeah,
which is going on forever. It could
yeah.
become like that,
It
right?
could. It could. Again, when I grew up in Bombay and Delhi and Bangalore, but I've been in this country for so long, and it's always striking to me that when we educate people, particularly in the social sciences and the professions, at least in America, our primary examples are American and to some extent European. Now, you and I know that there's plenty of examples of creativity all over the world, and the reason people don't access these and learn from them and engage with them is that it's not easy to do. It's not available. The stories are not immediately, instantly accessible the way you could find something on Mr. Gates or Mr. Musk.
Yeah.
So this is really the foundational attempt. That by the way, Gopal, since this is a session on books, is a general comment. Rohan Murthy, who's Narayan Murthy's son, funded another nice effort at Harvard called the Murthy Classical Library of India, which is to take all of India's classics and make them, and there's almost like 500 of them so far, that are translated into simple English and beautiful books and made. You can find them in India, Murthy Classical Library of India. And again, the idea is that if you want to study the classics in the Western world, why be limited to the Greek and the Roman classics and the Latin classics? What about the classics from Persia, from China, from India, places like that? So the idea is to broaden the repertoire of exemplars from whom we can extrapolate lessons and learn. So,
But the one thing I would say is, even though you probably precede them and summarize them, the interviews are very candid. And from a reader perspective, that is of some value, because they are looking almost through the telescope into the man's heart or his mind, and that you've been able to elicit this and made them comfortable enough to. For example, since I'm familiar with the detail, and we are not here to discuss that, your interview with Ratan Tata on inclusiveness.
mhm.
It's a short one. I mean, the number of interviews in this book are probably not more than 4 pages each, and the book is about 250 pages, so that you can see the very large number of interviews. But, as I read this book, and I just want to share with you, this is not about what I have SPJ and Institute of Management on what makes Indian enterprises become institutions. So it's in the same genre, though the words used are different. And we found it very difficult to find institutions with a certain definition. Today we are not going to go into that. And we concluded that we desperately need many more institutions in the Indian enterprise world. Your book comes to something similar, but it's come from a different route. You come by air, I've come by train, or whatever you want to call it. And I was very interested in your reference to Alexis de Tocqueville and Mr. Zinn, both writing about the same America at about the same time and coming to completely opposite conclusions. One saying this is fantastic and one saying this is terrible. The world is today full of polar opposites. It's in politics, it's in business, it's in courts, it's in everywhere. Did you get any insights into, is this a first time in human civilization at the same time? And will that influence some of our discussions on enterprises and business? Both of you can offer your comment on this. This is meant for both of you.
Gopal, can you restate the question? You're cutting in and out. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Is my voice breaking? Is there a bandwidth problem?
There may be, but anyway, just restate the question. That's okay.
Let me restate the question. Two people who wrote books at about the same time about America and came to absolutely opposite conclusions. That one said this is terrible and one said this is terrific, because they had a different lens through which they saw it. Mm-hmm. We see this repeated in modern day politics, in business, in enterprise, the role of enterprise in society. So my question to you is, are there ways in which leaders whom you studied have reconciled such opposite views and moved their company forward?
So I don't think this is new at all. I just picked that example because I guess at the time of writing that chapter, it was foremost in my mind. What Gopal is referring to the audience is the history that the European traveler Alexis de Tocqueville wrote when he traveled across America, saying, "Wow, there's so much entrepreneurship and creativity here. Everywhere you look, it's amazing, and there's freedom and this and that." And Howard Zinn, who's a historian, contemporary historian, writing just a few decades ago. So Alexis de Tocqueville is, centuries ago. And Howard Zinn, writing about the same time through the lens of a historian writing today, basically looked at the same data and reached the opposite conclusion, that this is the people's history of the United States is one of exclusion of the many to benefit the few. So he was trying to make a point, which is that when you look at data, of course you have to interpret the data. And as somebody trained primarily in mathematics, I mean, I understand logic and I understand data as my core, but I've grown to appreciate in my middle age that there's a context around which the data were produced. You have to interrogate the data to be intelligent about it before you conclude something. You have to understand the provenance of the data. Where did the data come from? Who generated it? Why was it generated in that way? And then what lessons can we draw from it? It's a basic lesson in inference that I think applies to all walks of life, right? And we forget that. And to your question, Gopal, about, how have leaders done this? I think we see this actually. There's a lot of talk these days about, in America, it's going under the acronym of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But it's basically just saying, let's have diverse points of view around the table for anything. And of course, having more women around as opposed to, a boardroom or a C-suite or a management team full of men is one way to squash diversity. So having more women is better, and having more diverse voices is better, which is the point that the Tocqueville and Zinn example is trying to make. I have to mention, I have a young colleague, Rem Kenning at Harvard, who wrote a lovely paper showing that recently that whenever women, this is looking at extremely large samples of American data, whenever women are less involved in the production of ideas, whether it's in R&D or in the production process in companies, you demonstrably get statistically, significantly, and meaningfully less outputs that have anything to do with women's welfare, right? And the effect is very large. It was published in Science, which is most important scientific journal of our time. And it's just dramatic. I mean, I feel like I know this intuitively, that there are many things that I as a man would not recognize or not have front and center, but my wife or my daughter or my mother would correct me and say, "Oh, but this is not how, how we would see it." So I think that's what that example is trying to probe. And I'm sure Zia, I mean, this is front and center when you were in the courtroom. You were talking about your early experiences. This must have come through in many ways.
Zia, your comments. I mean, you see, of course, that's part of your profession to see people with opposite points of view arguing, and then your client is one of them. But I'm not talking from that legal point of view. I'm asking you this question in a broader framework of your being a business leader rather than any point of law. Would you like to comment on the same subject?
I think I totally agree with what Tarun is saying. I think that, leaders use the data available to them at that point in time and in history and make their decisions, right? And therefore, I think that the two examples which are there in the book, I guess it's using data at different historical milestones. For me, I think that, being in court, what I have learned is there's always a middle path that you end up arriving at, which is the path that takes the narrative forward. So if leaders are unwavering in their point of view and stubborn, they lose the ability to navigate, and that, as you know, both of you better than most people, is not leadership. It's basically being able to dance and prance across the data, slice it and dice it in the way that works for the moment and the problem statement at that time. And I think that what I have learned is, not just women and men, but really across the board, leadership is about recognizing other points of view, about being able to say, I'm sorry, genuinely, about being able to retrace and come back, having learned from mistakes and licked your wounds in private. But that's I think what I would take away.
Okay, thanks for that input. I think we'll have time for just one last question before Reena brings in the questions from the audience. We are approaching the last 5 minutes of time.
Gopal,
Yeah.
Gopal, let me just tell you what I have when everybody walks into my room.
Excellent.
Very good. Excellent. That's very good.
That's what they read. When they're sitting in front of me, that's what they read.
Many people have entered your room and seen that signal now. I have something in my room.
Let me repeat the favor. This is what I have. It just says think.
IBM style. You know what I have in my room? I have an artifact which has teeth and bones of animals which are 40 million years old, mounted on a frame.
See, that lasts.
Sorry?
That's an artifact that lasts. It's like leadership that lasts.
Yeah, but that's not the reason I'm mentioning it. I'm mentioning it because this was taken from the slices of land in the Mediterranean when they were mining for phosphates. And people say, why do you keep this in your room? I said, it brings me a sense of humility. That I might be thinking I'm doing great things, but this has been going on for 40 million years. And Lata Mangeshkar sang, Naam Ghoom Jayega, Meri Awaaz Hi Meri Pehchan Hai. Anyway, a last question. Zia, you go first on the question I'm going to ask you. There is no doubt that India needs more institutions, India needs more leadership that lasts. And so books like the one Jeffrey Jones and Tarun have written must be read by more and more people. Can you think of just 2 or 3 off-the-cuff ideas as to how can, the 6 companies that I studied, or we studied in our research project, accounted for 35% of the Bombay Stock Exchange market cap. We have 5,000 companies, of which 4,994 account for the balance, and many of them account for nothing. India needs big institutional enterprises which correspond to the characteristics that Tarun has identified. Do you have any thoughts on how India can do that? Either of you, go. You could go as the thoughts come to your mind. Just a little wrap-up question.
Tarun, you go first.
I mean, as a sort of student of developing countries, I mean, let me back up, Gopal. I would say very simple answer. I think we need to educate playfully our children. What I mean by that is this whole discussion we just had about points of view and so on is to imbibe in them early on a sense of curiosity and a sense of play in learning, so that it's not a drag. Right? Learning in India is a drag. You've got to kind of struggle through school. It's painful. There's a uniform. I don't know if that's true anymore, but whatever. There's a method to the madness, and it's overly draconian and not particularly inspiring. So we need to educate better. And it's not only about everybody has a legal right to education. Of course, that's true, but there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip in that case as well. And the second thing is, which I'm very distressed about, in another role, you mentioned Kiran. So Kiran and I are two of the co-chairs of the Lancet Citizens Commission for Reforming India's Healthcare. The Lancet is the world's leading global health journal from the UK. And, it's kind of shocking that after COVID, I just looked at our recent budget, and our allocation as a society to health is minuscule. It's minuscule. There's no money going into health. Now, we have a number of healthcare titans profiled in the book. Good friends of mine. I mean, Devi Shetty, Kiran, Yusuf Hamid, a whole bunch of other people, Pratap Reddy, and they've done their bit. But it's as a society, health is not a voter concern. For instance, it just doesn't figure on people's list of things to hold politicians accountable for. It's treated as an expenditure on the national income statement. It's not treated as an asset class in the balance sheet, and that mindset is just backwards. So I think what we need to do to create institutions is to strengthen the foundations continually and inexorably on health and education. That would be my 50,000 foot answer.
Thank you, Zia.
I think switching topics, in your forward, Tarun, you said that everything should be founded ultimately on lasting institutional change is the words you used. And I like the phrase that you used, not episodes of individual CEOs as saviors, and that history matters. And I think that for our country, Gopal, I think that we need to still walk that journey. I think all our great houses which have institutionalized have started with that savior of a CEO. But I think the most important thing is the mindset and the value and the culture that he commands and controls for a sufficiently long period of time. And hopefully the he will become a she in some families. So I think that we have a few really good business houses that we can say are institutional, but I think we can create many more. And I think that we can and we will. As I say, it's ours to lose as a country. And I mean that even in terms of legacy and institutional building. But I think what will only happen, it will only happen if we get the culture and the value system right. For me, that's the bottom line. And if that ties into education, which imparts values, I would hook in Tarun's thoughts there.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, you have both been very forthcoming in not only talking about the minutiae of the book in the earlier part, but broadening the discussion into a much larger canvas. I've enjoyed having a chat with you, reading the book and raising questions. Reena, is there your time as the sun has come now? Or the audience's time in the sun through you?
Thank you so much, Mr. Gopalakrishnan, Dr. Khanna, and Ms. Mody. It was such an engaging discussion that had you not mentioned it's time for Reena to come in, I would have forgotten I have to come in because I was really enjoying the discussion. And I'm so glad, Zia, you mentioned education, but that's what I just wrote out. What about the role of education? And being a sociologist myself, play that. But we'll come to that later because several questions have come in from the audience and they're very interesting ones. So I'll start with the first one, Tarun, for you. This is from Deepak Jayaraman. Is there a big difference in the kind of leadership we need in emerging markets to build institutions that last as compared to those in the West? What are the unique challenges in emerging markets?
So thank you to you, Reena, for being part of this, and also thanks to Deepak for asking the question. Look, even the so-called emerged markets were emerging at one point, right? And so whether we look in today's developed countries at a moment in the past, or we look at today's developing countries, the one thing I would point to, Deepak, is that precisely because so many of the supporting mechanisms needed to foster creativity are less developed in the developing countries, because we're all works in progress at the end of the day. It is incumbent upon the entrepreneur to not just do what he or she sets out to do, but to also be cognizant of some of these limitations around them and do things about them. And not basically, essentially, just to caricature, not to say that's the job of the government. It might well be, but the government isn't going to get around to doing many of these things for quite some time because it has its own hands, proverbial hands full. So the leader's task becomes not just to, Devi Shetty is a good example, right? He's just a good friend. I spent a lot of time with him over the last 15 years. He wants to be a heart surgeon, right? He wants to be a pediatric heart surgeon. But it turns out to do that, he has to innovate in satellite-based telemedicine, in health insurance, in nursing education, in transporting patients from somewhere, in behavioral interventions to convince the patient that, no, I'm not cheating you, etc., etc. And you pick any entrepreneur, they've had to kind of compensate for these institutional deficiencies in a variety of ways. And I think that, to a first-order effect, is dramatically more the case in the developing countries than in the more institutionally mature ones.
Thank you, Tarun. There's another one from Ayush Pereira, which I'd like both you and Zia to take up. Do you believe that a good leader can make bad decisions and a bad leader can make good decisions? In which case, who is the good or the better leader?
Zia, you go.
So I'm a lawyer, so I say it depends. Right? It depends. Of course, a good leader can go wrong, for God's sakes. I think many do, and often. So I don't think that's a problem. As I said earlier, the good leader knows when to see that a mistake has been made, to retract and take the right step forward, having learned from the lessons of the mistake. Can a bad leader make good decisions? I'm sure some of them can be good, but if you're looking at it from a long-term analysis of what is a good leader, the good leader makes better, more sounder, more long-lasting, more thorough, more purposive, and more honest decisions. I think that's where it ends up.
Yeah, I would echo Zia's response, right? I like what Zia said earlier in our conversation, which is you have to be able to genuinely say sorry. And when you do that, it turns out the world forgives you most of the time. I have to go and say sorry to somebody for a mess up right now after this talk. So I'm preparing myself for embarrassment. But be that as it may, Gopal talked earlier about RNT's, Ratan Tata's really candid, lovely interview with us, right? And even though we just printed 4 or 5 pages, the actual interview is 40 pages. And again, it's publicly available. Very candid. When I'm dealing with labor in this situation in Korea, this is what happened. When we thought about Tata Nano, we inadvertently conceived of the lower income person thinking through differently about the process of buying. That's a mistake. And if you're not making mistakes, then you're not doing anything interesting. So you should be making mistakes and learning from them. That's what I would say to Ayush.
I think that's
Can
very
I add a
important.
little comment,
Sure, sure,
Rina? Can I
sure.
add a comment to
Yes,
the
please.
question asked by Ayush? You know, a good leader who's made a bad decision, or a good leader who's made a good decision, a good leader, full stop, always shares credit, takes the discredit, and says sorry. A bad leader who's made a good or a bad decision never shares the credit, takes the credit, passes the debit, and blames somebody else. I think that's a very simple way of putting it, but I hope that will be useful to Ayush. Please go ahead, Reena.
I think it's very important because, what you all are sharing are also some of the basic values that go into making a person. Whether it's a leader or not, everyone would be a leader if we have these core values of humanity. I think the very fact that you mentioned embarrassment or apologizing, which, all of you all mentioned, I think it's very important even in our own personal lives, to kind of get. Okay. There's another one. Zia, this one is for you. Would you say there are far more women leaders? There are far more women leaders in industry than before. Is this an organic or forced evolution? This is Raj Sondh for you, Zia.
I don't think there are that many more women leaders, actually. There could be much more. I think obviously more than before. But if you take the data again, the Fortune 500 are really dominated by men. Indian industry is dominated by men. I think what has changed is that we have started to celebrate our women more, and therefore it gets more visibility. And the women that have made their mark are happy to be showcased so that they can serve as role models for other women and inspire younger women to stay the course and give back to what they think that they benefited by. But, the data is still against us. And that's why I say that for me, the real change has to come from the men. And when the men become champions of change, as Australia has a program called Male Champions of Change, and when that is consistent, so, I basically always try and bring the point home when some of my male partners are perhaps having some sort of bias against the way they look at women working in litigation or something. I always go back and say, okay, if your daughter was working in someone else's office and this was the attitude they had towards her, you'd love it, right? And suddenly there's, newsflash. So I think what I try and do is make it very personal so that most of us have daughters by God's grace. And the minute you start taking the examples back into their own minds and their own hearts, it's amazing how quickly it changes, because you just have to make them wear that right hat. If this was your daughter, what would you be doing? How much of a wind would be blowing underneath her sails if she was yours? So what's the problem? And I think when you personalize it and you bring it home to an emotional level, which is logical, because I believe that if half the world, if Mao says we hold up half the sky, then we are half the talent. So what stupid man would want to lose us, right? So I think you just need to bring it home and make sure that they recognize the talent that they're losing. And then most times they get the plot. But are we still anywhere near the number we ought to be? I don't think so. I think it's another 10 years away, 15 years away, but we're on the right path. Let's put it that way.
That's very true. Thank you. But Tarun, when you were...
Can I just add to the response? There's a new person, since we have a legal here, Zia, with us. There's a new person appointed, one of our colleagues just appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown, and Jackson, and she's African American, and that's the first time as an African American woman. And what I was struck by is at going to the U.S. Supreme Court, and what I was struck by is Barack Obama immediately tweeted, "This is the best news for my daughters," right? Because Barack Obama's daughters are African American, and they're seeing a black woman on the US Supreme Court at the pinnacle of, at least in this country, the justice system. It matters. The role models really matter, right? We may say that, oh, we should learn from somebody else. And this goes back to the genesis of our project. It is irritating. I was a student in the Harvard MBA classroom, right? Gopal's son was in the Harvard MBA classroom. It was really irritating to me that everything was said in New York. I'm caricaturing back in the early 90s. And having different role models. Even now the students tell us, how come we don't have other people that come from where we come from? Now we may say, well, that's, very kind of parochial attitude that people have. They should learn from anybody and everybody. But the reality is that we like to learn from people who are around us, and women are encouraged by women role models, and it's a good thing. And African Americans are encouraged by African American role models. So broadening, and as Zia says, why not tap into all the available diversity of stories and talent and experiences to learn from? Any social scientist will tell you that you learn from variation, right? If you want to learn about animals, right, and you only look at puppies, you'll reach some strange conclusions about animals. You'll say all animals bark, right? And that won't be true. So if you confine yourself in statistical inference or any form of inference to an artificially constrained subpopulation, you've lost the game before you started. And that's kind of the way that we're going about it. We've either excluded all the women, or we've excluded all non-white people, or we've excluded black women, or whatever. And we're going about our business in the most ham-fisted way. So anytime there's a corrective to this, it's fabulous.
And, for your information, just this afternoon, they've announced the first time the SEBI chairman will be a woman.
Excellent.
And I think, Zia, correct me if I'm wrong, we have 3 women who are in the Supreme Court as justices, or 2 women, I've forgotten, which is a great progress compared to 0. Sorry?
I think it's 2, but we've had more women in the last decade than we've ever had before. So that's what I'm saying. It's changing. The landscape is changing. There's an acceptance much more than before. But, I agree that more women there are, the better the quality of the decision. And I think that's proved by data now, as Tarun was saying.
Absolutely. I mean, this is just what Tarun just said, that part of the decision making, that all changes if you have women involved participating. But we have 2 questions more to go. I mean, there are several more, but we have time for 2 questions. Gopal, this is for you. Have management values changed from the time, from your earlier times to present day, where political correctness, inclusiveness is more of a norm than an exception? And taking out from there, Sugata Menon asks you, Tarun, from the interviews you've had, what are the 3 common values you see among them?
Tarun, why don't you go first?
3 common values. Thank you for the question. 3 common values. I would say definitely humility would be up there. Really up there. I can't think of anybody who is presiding over. Maybe they were not humble throughout their career. It's possible, there's exuberance of youth and so on and so forth. But by the time that they are presiding over, they see the complexity and the fullness of life. It's really hard to find anyone in our database of 200 people who is not incredibly humble. And it's such a heartening thing. I actually want to only give you that one, because that to me is the most important. If you have that attitude, you will learn, right? And you will be able to speak truth to power. You'll be able to be courageous. You'll be able to learn from your mistakes. You'll be inclusive. The rest just follows. That's what I would say, because everybody's intelligent. Intelligence is overrated. It's not intelligent people, but most of them don't amount to anything. So that's my answer to Ms. Menon.
Thank you. Gopal?
If I understood the question, leadership and the political imperatives. Did I understand it correctly?
Yeah, how have management values changed from earlier times to present day, where political correctness, inclusiveness is far more a norm than an exception?
All I can say is this. If I just take Y minus 50, which is approximately the time I began my career, and today, the core competence of managers in Y minus 50 was political correctness, managing Delhi. Today, I don't think that is counted as one of the top things. I mean, there are certain sectors where that is still true, but many people don't regard that as the major competitiveness. It's customer, it is employees, it is technology, digitization, etc. So that's one thing I want to say. This point about political correctness has got a cultural basis as well. I don't think I can recall any time, even 50 years ago, when somebody would just take issue with the political master because the powers were distributed very differently. And I think in many ways that continues to be the case. I'm not sure that has changed greatly. So if something happens where you feel you should talk as a citizen and not be read as a corporate leader, the line is very thin. And those who transgress that sometimes have had small or big consequences. So I hope I've answered the question.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I
There
want
is
to read you a sentence from our preface because I answered the question and then I said, "Oh my God, did I write something different from this?" So the sentence at the end of our introduction, it says, "We are humbled," and this is a direct response to Ms. Menon. "We are humbled by the combination of audacity of intent, humility of demeanor, and steadfastness of purpose." She
I
wanted
think
three.
that also answers the next question where she's asked, what should startup entrepreneurs keep in mind in order to lead from the front? And there it is.
There it is. I'm done.
Yeah, that is absolutely wonderful. We still have a few more questions, but I think we are running out of time. But thank you so much, Tarun, Zia, and Gopal, for such an engaging evening discussion, a very important subject. I think it's time we really started teaching all this, not only in management schools. I think we need to really bring it to all undergrad schools, sections that we are teaching. And really, I feel a lot to do also not only with students who are doing commerce, but arts and humanities and sciences. I feel is really sorely lacking there. Teaching at the undergrad level, I see this vacuum, and therefore a book like yours is most welcoming and a must read. And the references that the students, yes, there it is, leadership to last.
Ria has her yellow stickies also. That's perfect.
Yes. Yes.
I did before I came on. I'm a good lawyer. I need to be prepared.
Thank you. For our audience, I would all those whose questions have been answered, Deepak, Ayush, Raj, Mohit, Sugata, please write into info@litlife.in for your vouchers, for your very interesting questions, fielded very well by our panelists. So thank you very much. And our next Business Shastras is going to be Arundhati Bhattacharya's book, Indomitable, which is going to be held at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We are breaking all time schedules on Women's Day, a book by Arundhati Bhattacharya, who's going to be in conversation with Shinjini Kumar. Till then,
it's a great book. It's a great book.
Thank
you so much for having us, and congratulations on the book once again, Tarun.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zia. Thank you, Gopal. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody. Really nice to see you all.
Thank you, Tarun. Thank you, Zia. Thank you, Reena, and to Tata Lit Life. It's been a pleasure to prepare and think about this session. I hope the audience enjoyed it. Take care.
Yes,
Bye.
thank you. Bye-bye. Take care. Good night.